This is the second of three modules which use Quakerism as a case study for demonstrating ways that religion engages in many different aspects of life. For this module, we explore how Quakers both impact and are impacted by science in general, and issues of the environment and climate change in specific. Quakers build theology from the interplay of their personal experiences with the divine, however they define that, with their core convictions, also known as testimonies, and all of this read through the lens of their context. A Quaker's theological context is highly impacted by where they fall within the significant theological diversity of Quakerism, which can run from evangelical Christianity all the way to a broad, universalist vision of God as a divine presence. This theology is also built from the interplay of the individual experience of one Quaker with the wisdom of the entire Quaker community. This can be both historically, all Quakers throughout time, that is, reading what Quakers have written about certain subjects beforehand, and also within one's current Quaker community, which could be termed either a meeting or a church. Now, our chapter, this module, Cherice Bock argues that these are the central tenets of Quakerism. 1. A personal experience of the divine. 2. Corporate discernment, in that the community must all play a role in decision-making. 3. The testimonies are rooted in the presence of the divine within all people. The sense of God's presence within all people is also what informs the sense of equality, which Quakers emphasize, which we also see in the sense of corporate discernment, where all people could potentially bring to the decision-making process for a Quaker meeting any message from the divine about where the meeting should go or not. So as a result, if the divine is present within all people, then everyone has the ability to say something that is valuable. 4. The divine calls Quakers to engage in direct work in the current time and place, which aids the divine spirit in its own reconciling work. Or, to put more bluntly, to make the world a better place for all of creation, Quakers have to actually do actual work to make that happen. Now, these tenets have existed in some form since the beginning of Quakerism during the time of the English Civil War. Shifting over, what is ecotheology? It is a response to the environmental crisis which seeks to find within scripture and religious tradition indications of how humanity is supposed to live in right relationship or harmony and balance with the creation. A core concern in Christian ecotheology is to reassess the traditional Christian vision of humanity being above and outside of creation, and to instead insist that humanity is a part of creation. Humans are given the task of caring for the environment, and by caretaking, participating in co-creation of the environment with God. Now, ecotheology's roots as a specific theological approach are in the Christian tradition, but over the last several decades, it has expanded to many other traditions and religions. This is a rejection of what are seen as additions to the tradition from Western culture and colonialism, which is the idea that creation exists to serve humanity and not the other way around, and that these are not core things to Christianity itself. This idea that Christianity teaches that creation serves humans. This requires a reassessment of Christianity itself. Now, when seeking to bridge ecotheology with Quakerism, some challenges emerge from within Quakerism, which might make this endeavor more difficult than it would seem. Quakerism has its roots deep in Enlightenment thinking, which placed the emphasis on rationality, individuality, and shifted authority away from traditional hierarchies and communal concepts of church. Quakers retained a strong belief in divine revelation, But when you combine this with this intense individualism and anti-authoritarianism, this led to a rejection of any hierarchical structures. This emphasized the Christian concept of the priesthood of all believers, more than any previous Christian tradition. Again, this idea says that God can speak to and through any individual, meaning that any person had the ability to speak authoritatively about God's desire for themselves and their community. This was a deeply ambivalent gift. While it allowed Quakerism to develop a unique spirituality and practice, it also, somewhat paradoxically, smuggled in the Enlightenment overemphasis on rationality and on objectivity and on the dualistic separation of all things into contrasting, contradictory binaries: good, bad, masculine, feminine, humanity, nature, etc. This places the emphasis on the part of the binary this framework views as better, masculine, humanity, objectivity, etc., and dismisses the one viewed as lesser, feminine, nature, subjectivity. This dovetails with essential aspects of Quaker tradition in unexpected ways. As Quaker worship has historically practiced silence and emphasizes the realm and the necessity of silence and the role that silence plays in worship, this concept of waiting expectantly upon the Lord, it emphasizes this over physical sacraments. This can lead to placing more importance on spiritual matters than physical ones, where Quakers can feel that they're supposed to transcend their physical form and focus on some higher spiritual plane. This can also lead to an emphasis on rationality over emotion, logic over experience, which is again paradoxical for a tradition with such a strong emphasis on the experience of the divine. This places a greater value on the intellectual and on masculine forms of leadership, which can tend to dismiss the value of other expressions of leadership knowledge and experience. Power can sometimes flow in only specific directions, therefore. The emphasis on individual experience has two major results. One, each individual Quaker can develop a sense that they have the most complete experience or understanding of the divine, and can lead Quakers to view the rest of the world through the ways that it interacts with us, and not viewing the world as an interdependent whole, with some obvious implications for Quaker approaches to the environment. Two, each individual Quaker can develop a hierarchy of knowledge. As they can individually experience the divine, they can reject interpretations, biblical passages, theologies, and practices which do not meet their own individual sense of truth. Now, a possible response to this lies with the lack of a strict delineation between the sacred and profane in Friend's theology. Quakers de-emphasize physical sacraments, which actually results in a strong emphasis on the sacredness of all things. Sacredness isn't the reserve, therefore, of specific sacraments like communion or baptism, but extends to the entirety of creation. When you couple this with the Quaker view that divine exists in all of creation, this results in the potential for Quakers to see every moment as sacred, every person as the Spirit embodied. Now, creating a specifically Quaker ecotheology requires rooting any new theological idea in the Quaker distinctives, the aspects which are foundational to a Quaker approach to religious life. Now, that would be the belief in that of God in each person, the conviction that God is still speaking to humans today and hasn't stopped when the Bible was written and that was the last that God said, but the idea that God is continuously speaking to humans. The commitment to live Quaker values and ideals in everyday life, and the necessity to question our assumptions. Reflecting these concerns, Bock creates a framework in this chapter for Quaker ecotheology, which the tradition could use in the future to both develop Quaker ecotheology further, as well as to lay out ways that Quaker testimony can reflect this emphasis on the ecological. These include 8 things. 1. A mysticism and emphasis on the spirit. 2. Communalism. 3. The ability to deconstruct or remix. 4. Taking the Bible seriously. 5. An emphasis on reconciliation, equity, and justice. 6. An emphasis on simplicity. 7. A willingness to recognize the Spirit or God or the divine at work in other traditions and not just Quakerism and not also just Christianity. And 8. This previously discussed lack of a strict delineation and separation between the sacred and the profane. Now, each of these 8 ideas are explored in depth in the chapter and are given a bit more flesh and structure, and I would recommend that you go back to the chapter and read those in a bit more detail.